To have an informed discussion of the nature of Black ASL, we first need to explore the history of Black-deaf education. It is important to note that the American School for the Deaf was founded in 1817 and was integrated 8 years later. Most schools in the northern regions did not have policies on segregation. Schools for Black-deaf children were not established until after the Civil War in a total of 17 states and the District of Columbia. A number of these schools for Black-deaf students were not in proximity to white schools. Some schools for Black-deaf students were on campuses for white deaf students, however, were labeled as colored or Negro departments, and Black students were segregated and isolated.
I will summarize the data contained on the two charts you just viewed. We note the time period between founding schools for white deaf children and founding schools for Black deaf children averaged 33 years. The time from founding of schools for Black deaf children until the final integration of schools for white deaf children averaged 72 years. The case of the Washington, D.C. school is particularly striking, as the time from founding the school for Black deaf children and integrating the school for white deaf children amounted to 101 years. Now, of interest is the status of education in Louisiana. A school for Black deaf children was not established until 1938. In addition, the school for white deaf children was desegregated in 1978, well after the Brown v. Board of Education decision requiring integration of Black and white students in 1954. Now, there is a historically significant legal case called Miller v. D.C. Public Schools and Kendall School. The case was brought to court in 1952, just 2 years before Brown v. the Board of Education. Kendall School opened in 1857, and Black children were allowed to enroll. However, in the early 1900s, a group of white parents protested that policy. Subsequently, Black deaf children were consigned to a school in Overlea, Maryland, near Baltimore. The Millers, a Black family from D.C., are shown in this photograph. Mrs. Miller sued the school and won. Thereafter, Black deaf children were allowed back on the campus of Kendall, but still in a segregated area until 1958.
In the schools and departments for Black deaf students, who were the teachers? In the following clip, you will see former students from Virginia describing their experiences.
Did I have Black and white teachers? Yes, I had both.
Me too.
Yeah, same here. I had both Black and white teachers.
Mine were the same. What about male and female?
I had both.
Yeah, I'd say about the same.
Yeah, I think it was pretty much the
They
same
were equally
too.
represented.
I
It
agree.
was
Pretty
about
well
the same. We
balanced.
had a good balance. We had both black female teachers as well as white teachers, black and white.
What about hearing and deaf?
My teachers were deaf.
They were deaf?
Pooh, were they deaf? I could tell you.
Yeah, they were deaf. Absolutely. They were deaf. At the school for the deaf children, I was trying to learn to speech read using my residual hearing and headset system. I just didn't get it. It was really hard because I'm deaf, so they decided to bring in an assistant teacher to teach speech reading, and I finally made progress.
Well, just about all of my teachers could hear. In fact, I only remember having 2 deaf teachers.
Yeah, that's true. I had the same thing. In some schools, the teachers were black and were not deaf. In a few states, there were laws prohibiting white teachers from teaching black students. As an example, in 1901, the state of Tennessee passed a law prohibiting white teachers from teaching at black schools for the deaf. When black deaf students graduated from black deaf schools, they sought employment as teachers at other schools for black deaf children. This was similar to what was occurring at other schools for white deaf children. For example, when deaf students graduated from the American School for the Deaf, they went on to teach at other deaf schools. Some teachers, however, were white and taught at schools for black deaf children. For example, the Alabama School for Negro, Deaf, and Blind opened in 1892 in Talladega. This school had only white teachers until 1968. Another example can be seen from the Maryland School for the Deaf in Overley. There, white teachers taught black deaf students. The following is a photograph of a white teacher with her students. There is a connection to be noted between historically black colleges and universities and schools for black deaf children. Some black deaf schools hired black teachers specifically from historically black colleges and universities. Summer training courses were offered, for example, at West Virginia State College for Negroes, the Hampton Institute, and the Southern School for Negro Deaf in Louisiana. In the next clip, a former student from Virginia describes her experience with the oral instruction method.
I learned home signs from other students at Hampton. Teachers use the oral method with speech reading, and that didn't work for me. I thought it best to teach in sign language so I could understand. I transferred to another school.
In the next clip, Mary Herring Wright describes the teachers at the North Carolina School for Black Deaf Students.
Did your teacher sign?
My teachers?
Yes. Did they sign ASL?
We had 2 or 3 teachers
Well, how did your
who
teacher
signed
sign?
very well. They were really good signers. 2 of them worked at the oral instruction school for deaf children,
Oh, the oral school.
the oral school in town.
So they both knew sign language.
Oh, yes, they both knew sign language. Both of our teachers, Mrs. Edmondson and Mrs. Mask, were good at their signing. They both signed ASL well.
They used ASL.
Oh, yes, they used ASL.
At the American School for the Deaf in Connecticut, ASL had been predominantly used until the late 1860s. At that time, oral instruction methods started to take hold. At schools for black deaf children, these methods were not strictly enforced, and instruction through the use of ASL was still practiced. White deaf students struggled with communication through the use of oral methods of instruction, while black deaf students had clear communication through the use of sign language. While black deaf students should have had a better education, ironically, the educational focus was on vocational training, and as a result, the students suffered academically.
In this next segment, we highlight the 6 Black deaf schools involved in our research. Let's take a look at a group from North Carolina. The students captured in that piece are alumni of the North Carolina State School for the Colored, Deaf, and Blind, located in Raleigh, North Carolina. The School for White Children was established way back in 1845, while the School for Black Children was not established until 1869. During this era, the School for Black Children were vocationally oriented. Black deaf teachers taught at the schools. A renowned graduate of the North Carolina School is a woman by the name of Mary Herring Wright. Mary graduated in the class of 1941. In the following clip, Mary shares a few of her experiences from school.
The girls learned how to sew.
To sew?
Oh, yes, how to sew. And we learned how to cook. Yes, we learned how to cook. And we learned how to wait tables.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
Carry the trays and wait tables.
Oh, what we call waitressing.
And we also learned to type. In fact, I was the one who asked the superintendent to let the deaf girls learn how to type. Some of the other deaf girls, they didn't want any parts of learning to type. We also learned how to clean, keep a clean house. As for the deaf boys, now they were taught to make furniture and to care for farm chores. We had a large farm. We had cows and pigs. We also grew vegetables for the entire school. I remember the blind boys being taught how to make brooms and to make mattresses.
Really?
They were also taught to sing and play musical pieces on the piano. Meanwhile, the deaf boys were taught how to mend shoes.
I remember being taught to sign my name. I read her lips as she asked what my name was. I mouthed, "My name is LaTanya." She said, "No, what is your name sign?" I said, "Well, what's your name sign for me?" So she gave me the name sign LaTanya. I was standing among a group of people whose hands were flying and they were communicating. I was stunned. I cried like a baby. I just wanted to go home, but I knew I had to wait until Friday. Finally, Friday came and I got to go home with my mom. I didn't want to go back to school, but I had to. My old school, I wore my hearing aids all the time, but
Really?
at this school, I was being told to take them off. No, my mama said I have to always keep them on, never to take them off. I was told I had to take them off. I wanted to take them to the dorm, but I couldn't. I felt empty. My hearing aids were being replaced by a bulky headphone.
I remember those.
You did?
I wasn't having it.
In the clip we just viewed, a former student shares what it was like for her when she first went to school. The School for White Deaf Children was founded in 1850.
The Department for Colored Deaf and Blind Children opened in 1887, but later burned down. A new school called the Madison Street School was opened in 1950.
Here is one of its graduates talking about the school.
Tell us your name.
My name is Pamela Baldwin.
I recall you telling me you attended a segregated school for Black deaf children. Please share with us some of your experiences from that time.
Yes, certainly. When I was about 8 years old, that's when I enrolled at the Madison School for Black, Deaf, and Blind Children. I remember being 8 years old and starting to learn sign language. I would observe and learn from other students. There are many of us in one classroom, different grade levels and varying ages. It was quite the mix. I remember my teacher. We only had one teacher, Mrs. Stanval, as I recall. We really didn't get much of an education from her. I remember we drew pictures, art, and I do recall writing words down and learning some basic signs. As for after-school activities, there wasn't much going on. That's the way it was.
So you really didn't know much sign language?
Exactly. Not when I was growing up. I lost my hearing at age 2 or 3. It was a while until my parents discovered I'd lost my hearing. As to communication with my family, we used gestures, home signs, but I was always using my eyes, very observant. I picked up fast. I paid attention because I wanted to go to public school with my sister. They paid me no heed, said I couldn't go, wouldn't be able to communicate, so I waited until my mother asked around and found a school for Black deaf children, the Madison Street School. Ironically, she found out her friend had a deaf son who attended Madison School. She gave us the information, and finally I enrolled at 8 years old. I recall learning sign language when I was 8, which was quite late. I remember I could spell my name, but I didn't know much real sign language. I do recall learning sign language, though. Here you will see clips of former students talking about how teachers communicated with students.
You remember that
Yes,
teacher.
I do remember her.
Okay,
And the other
we've
one
talked
too?
about
Right.
those two teachers, but what about your teachers in general? Were they skilled or so-so?
They were okay.
Well,
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, the teachers were pretty decent. They signed well enough. I will never forget this one teacher. She made the students use the oral method of instruction. She forced the students. Every day it was the same old thing. She forced us to watch her lips and repeat after her. I remember going through the motions as the other kids looked on. Finally, I said, "Why are you forcing the students to do this? Why do you keep talking? Why aren't we using sign language? Why are you forcing students to follow your lips? We're deaf." Do you know what she did? She had the nerve to hit me. She hit me hard, too, right upside my back of my head. Then she grabbed me by the arm and took me straight to the principal's office, told the principal that I refused to lip read, that I wanted to sign instead. The principal heard her out and said, "Well, let him sign." That teacher did not like that answer, but you should have seen my face.
What did you do?
I'll tell you what I did. Hightailed it right back to the class, told everybody, no more of that lip reading. We can sign now. The class couldn't believe it. Said, "Ooh, that Janice is bad." I showed her.
I remember one female teacher. She wasn't deaf and taught speech. You know, she actually wanted us to learn letters and words just by watching her lips. I mean, come on, I'm deaf. I couldn't do that, even though she would repeatedly hit me with the ruler to force me to get it right. Eventually, she left and things changed. Was it ASL?
My
I think your
No,
teacher signed
it
well.
was mostly signed English.
No, my teachers used signed English. English, definitely. They
Yeah,
followed English
I'd say so
sentence
too. It
structure.
was mostly signed English. I mean, a little bit of ASL, but mostly signed English.
Yeah. No ASL.
They were not using it.
Not at that time. The School for White Deaf Children was established in 1857 in Austin, Texas. Thereafter, the School for Black Deaf Children, named the Asylum for Colored Youth and Orphans, was founded in the year 1887. It was also located in Austin. Later, the name was changed to Texas Blind Deaf Orphan School, abbreviated BDO. Now, the BDO school was unique on account of having deaf children, blind children, and hearing orphan children simultaneously educated in one school. They all knew sign language, and some hearing orphans adventitiously became interpreters due to exposure to sign language and deaf culture. That was a photo of the Texas school founded by a former slave whose name was William Holland. He hired 3 black deaf teachers. Later on, another administration hired Otis Massey, a black deaf teacher who graduated from Gallaudet College. The majority of the school's faculty were white people. The Texas schools for black and white deaf children were integrated in 1965. Here is a clip of 3 students conversing about attending a school where black and white students were integrated.
Did you attend an all-black school?
No, it was racially mixed in elementary school.
It was.
Yes, black deaf, Latino deaf, pretty much any race of deaf students you can name. In middle school, the same racial mix, but high school, woo, all black. I was blown away.
All black?
Yes, in my time. I'm talking students en masse, all black. Different signing, different culture. I was raised to have this pleasing demeanor, be easygoing. You know, when you're around other races, you tend not to be showy, act out, display emotions, have this polite facade. Here, no pretense. Off the chain. The vibe, the style.
It's black culture.
I was taken aback. Understand, I grew up in a Christian home. I was still very green, innocent. At high school, I changed into who I really am. A new way of being.
Interesting. And what about you?
Well, I guess my experience was pretty similar to hers. In elementary school, it was a pretty mixed group. There were white, Latino, black students. It was mixed. In fact, I was probably only one of the 2 or 3 black students there at the time. There were more whites, and school was sort of laid back until I got to middle school, and that's when my whole world, my whole environment just changed because now I had to be more careful. I had to keep my eyes open and just be aware of what was happening around the school with each group. I had to know what was going on. In high school, actually both in middle and high school, there were mostly black groups of students. The same was true in college. There were mostly black students. For me, it was just elementary school that was mixed.
And your experience?
Well, I grew up in a mixed environment. There were both black and white students there.
And was it the same in high school?
Oh, yes, the same in high school.
The School for White Deaf Children opened in 1858 in Talladega, The school for black deaf children was opened in the same area in 1892. This particular school for black deaf children was different from other schools because this school had white deaf teachers until 1968. Take a look at some former students discussing their teachers.
Were your teachers black or white?
Well, in Georgia, I found out that all of their teachers were black. Our school team played basketball against them, and I couldn't believe it. I looked and said, wait a minute, what is this? Where are all of our black
That's the
teachers?
way it was then.
That made me angry. At our school in Alabama, the teachers were deaf, and also they were all white. The principal was also white, but he was not deaf.
What was that sign you used?
You know, principal, the principal of the school.
That's his sign for principal.
Right. He was able to hear, and he wasn't deaf. His name was Mr. James. I don't remember his first name, but let me tell you, he was not nice at all. He was one mean principal. It was okay, though. I was really happy that we were able to learn, and at least the teachers were deaf and signed fluently. It was great. Even though Brown versus Board of Education had been decided in 1954, some schools were resistant to desegregation. In 1967, a lawsuit was filed and won by Christina Archie against the Alabama Institute for the Deaf. The resulting desegregation plan was to have 11 black deaf students be transferred to the school for white deaf children. The School for White Deaf Children opened in Staunton, Virginia in 1839. The School for Black Deaf Children opened in 1909 in Newport News and was called the Virginia State School for the Colored Deaf and Blind. The school later moved to Hampton, Virginia. This school was founded by Mr. William Ritter. He was a white deaf man and also a graduate of the Staunton School for the Deaf and Gallaudet College. Founding a school for black deaf children was no easy task. Mr. Ritter worked diligently for 9 years, after which he finally succeeded in establishing the school. At the school, the students received vocational training. The students also engaged in recreational activities. The schools for white deaf children and black deaf children remained segregated until 1965. The following are some images prior to 1965. Beginning in 1965, the classes in both schools were integrated. In the next clip, you will see a former student talking about his school experience during segregation. Well, let me explain to you what happened. Back in my day, things were different. I was born and raised in Smithfield, Virginia.
Just like you.
Well, born and raised. My parents were deaf.
Your parents were deaf?
Yes. My mother, she was hard of hearing and was able to use her speech. My dad, however, used sign language, but at the time, there weren't any schools for black deaf children. The school in Newport News had not yet been founded. My grandfather never went to school at Gallaudet College. He did graduate at the time, but he didn't.
Your grandfather?
Yes, my grandfather, he was deaf.
Your grandfather attended Gallaudet College.
Way back then.
He didn't have an opportunity to go to Gallaudet College, but let me tell you what did happen. On one occasion, my grandfather met a gentleman by the name of Mr. William Ritter. They met at a print shop located on a small street in Hampton. The two of them struck up a conversation, and Mr. Ritter was surprised to find out that there were so many black deaf adults. My grandfather told him that there weren't just deaf adults, but that he also had a young son, that he had a 6-year-old son who was also deaf. Mr. Ritter decided to go to Hampton to approach legislators and see what could be done to establish a school for black deaf students. He also had to speak with other legislators in Richmond, but eventually things worked out and it was approved.
Mm-hmm.
In the following clip, a group of younger students talk about the quality of education for black deaf students.
That's right.
That was a good school, right? Mostly white teachers.
I don't know.
But what happened there was really the fault of the Board of Education. What they should have done was more research to find out the best methods of instruction, perhaps a classroom observation or team teaching to see what the most effective teaching methods were. There wasn't even a curriculum there.
We had no books.
The only thing they did was write a report, give it to the principal, and then send it on to the board. No one bothered to find out what was happening in the classroom, and that hurt the school. The only thing they could do was raise the white flag and just shut it down.
Raise the white flag. That boy is crazy.
I was happy when the school finally closed. In fact,
It's so bad.
when anyone in the community asks, "Where did you graduate?" I do not mention my high school. I only mention my college. The School for White Deaf Children in Louisiana opened in 1852. The School for Black Deaf Children did not open until 1938. It was called the Southern School for the Colored, Deaf, and Blind and was on the campus of Southern University. In the following clip, some former students discuss the history of deaf education at the Southern School for the Deaf. Well, at my school, my mother complained to them and suggested I transfer to the Louisiana School for the Deaf. I was about 14 years old at the time and was planning to go to that school because I wasn't allowed to sleep in the dorm as I had an issue with bedwetting that I was unable to control, and they weren't happy. Like I said, my brother was going to help me transfer to the Louisiana School for the Deaf. This was now around the year, 1976, about 76. This was the school for white deaf children, and I was looking forward to going there.
When did you get in?
Well, my school eventually changed their mind and said I could come back. Finally, I was allowed to sleep in the dorm. At this point, I was 16 years old. The teachers could not sign. They could only use the alphabet to fingerspell words. Most of the teachers fingerspelled everything, and occasionally they wrote on the blackboard.
The board in the front of the room?
Sometimes they would write from our book, and we would copy it off of the board. Whenever they tried to explain what was written on the board, they could only fingerspell, and most of us couldn't understand what was being taught. Writing should have helped us to understand, but just fingerspelling the words didn't help at all. We were at a disadvantage because we didn't use those words with our families or pick them up in other social settings, and we needed an education that the school was supposed to offer. I continued to complain and things didn't improve until the news media came on campus and exposed what was happening. I believe that was in 1978. As a result of the reporters investigating what was happening and uncovering the problems that existed, the school eventually closed. There were a lot of problems at the school, and all this happened at the expense of our education. Other children were receiving a great education at their schools. One could get a good education at LSD. Compare what was happening at the Louisiana school with ours. At LSD, they had deaf teachers fluent in sign language.
LSD teachers were fluent.
Right. At our schools, the teachers were not deaf and could only fingerspell. I heard the state had taken a look at the curriculum at the Louisiana School for the Deaf and then suggested that our school be closed and the students transferred.
They transferred all the students to LSD.
Right. The Health, Education, and Welfare Department said our school should be closed and the students moved because the education was much better at the Louisiana School for the Deaf. There were no lesson plans nor curriculum at the Southern School for the Deaf. The students could not understand the teachers, and it was just better to close it down and move.